"I'd rather die," the Apache woman said when the rancher paid $3. The heat of the twin suns made the dry ground shimmer. The wind, blowing over the desert plains of the frontier colony, stirred the dust into small whirlwinds. A man stood in the middle of the town, his boots sinking slightly into the dirt as he watched the busy market. Ethan Callahan had seen many strange things in his travels, but this colony was different. There was something about the wild frontier, something that called to him. It wasn't just about the land, it was the people, too. Ethan was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face showed the wear of a hard life. His dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the crowd. He was a rancher, having come to this part of the galaxy to build his future. But the colony was small, and without help, there was no way he'd be able to keep the ranch running. He needed workers, strong, capable hands. The market was loud, a mixture of voices haggling over goods, children running through the narrow streets, and traders shouting out their wares. But Ethan wasn't here for the market. He was here for something else. At the center of the marketplace stood a makeshift stage with a rough wooden auction block. It was small, barely more than a platform, but it was the place where the people of the colony bought and sold anything they could. Ethan walked toward it, his boots thudding softly on the hard dirt. On the platform, a tall man in a dark cloak stood beside a woman with sharp, defiant eyes. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair that fell to her shoulders, and a figure that seemed to carry the weight of the desert itself. Her skin was the color of rich earth, and her posture spoke of generations of pride. "Step right up!" the auctioneer shouted. "Get yourselves a fine worker. Strong, capable, and ready for any job." The crowd murmured, looking over the woman with interest. Ethan's eyes never left her. Her name was Tala, and she was not like the others. She stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed as she glanced around. The auctioneer had made a mistake by putting her on the block. She wasn't like the others who had been sold before her. They had been scared, broken, but not her. The crowd seemed uneasy. Tala's gaze held them, daring them to make an offer. Ethan knew what that meant. She was wild. She wasn't going to be easy to tame. "Who will start the bid?" the auctioneer asked, his eyes scanning the crowd. Ethan stepped forward, his calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the tense atmosphere. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, weighing them in his hand before raising his voice. "I'll pay $3, he said firmly. There was a pause. The crowd whispered among themselves, their eyes darting from the rancher to the woman on the stage. $3. It was an absurdly low price for someone like her, but there was something about Tala that caught Ethan's attention. He wasn't here to buy just any worker. He needed someone who could handle the harsh conditions of the frontier. Someone who had the same fire inside that he did. Tala looked at him, her eyes narrowing. A small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. She had heard this before. $3? She asked, her voice low, almost a growl. "I'd rather die." It was the first time anyone had spoken like that to the auctioneer. The man paused, looking nervously at the other bidders. But then he laughed, a deep, hollow laugh that seemed to echo off the walls of the surrounding buildings. "She's a tough one," he said. "But if $3 is what you offer, $3 it is." Ethan didn't flinch. He knew the woman's pride, and he wasn't about to back down. He had seen the same defiance in his own father. In fact, it was what had brought him here to the frontier in the first place, his own need to prove himself in a world that was always trying to break him. He walked toward the platform, his eyes never leaving Tala's. "You don't have to like it," he said quietly, "but you'll work for me. You don't have much of a choice now." Tala glared at him. "I'll work for no man," she said coldly. "I won't be anyone's slave." "Then you'll be free," Ethan said, his voice calm. "You can leave whenever you want." Tala looked at him, her expression unreadable. It was a challenge, but it wasn't a fight. Not yet. The auctioneer waved his hand, signaling that the deal was done. "Get her off the block, then," he said. "She's yours now." With a nod, Ethan stepped forward and helped Tala down from the platform. She didn't resist, but there was no trust in her eyes. Only suspicion. Only a quiet fury. They walked together toward the edge of town, where Ethan's small ranch was located, far from the watchful eyes of the settlement. The trip was long, and the land seemed to stretch on forever. The harsh wind bit at their faces, and the sun was relentless. The journey back was mostly quiet. Tala kept her distance, not looking at Ethan, not speaking a word. For his part, Ethan didn't say anything either. There was no point in trying to talk to her yet. He had seen enough of the world to know when silence was more valuable than words. As they passed through the outskirts of town, Ethan glanced at Tala. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were focused on the horizon, as if she were preparing for something. Preparing for what? He wasn't sure. Tala for the first time spoke again. "What do you want from me?" Ethan shrugged, still looking ahead. "I need help. Simple as that. There's no one else who can work the land like you can." She snorted. "You think I'll help you just because you bought me?" Ethan's eyes turned to meet hers. "No. I think you'll help me because, like me, you've got nothing left. This land is our future." Tala didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth of his words settled between them like a weight, neither acknowledging nor denying it. As they reached the ranch, the evening sun began to dip behind the jagged mountains in the distance. The stars were already starting to appear, dotting the sky like 1,000 tiny lanterns. Ethan turned to face Tala. "You can go if you want," he said, "but I don't think you will." Tala looked at him. Her defiance was still there, but there was something else now, a question. She didn't speak, but the silence between them said everything. The days following the auction were long and grueling. The frontier was not kind to anyone, and the desert's unforgiving winds seemed to always be at their backs. Ethan and Tala traveled together, the silence between them thick, almost as if it were an invisible barrier neither of them knew how to cross. Ethan led the way, guiding his small but sturdy wagon, pulled by 2 tired horses. The ground beneath them cracked and dry, a sign of the drought that had made this part of the land almost impossible to live on. But it was the kind of place where men and women like Tala could survive. It was a place where survival was everything. Tala rode silently beside him, perched on the back of a horse. Her dark eyes watched the endless horizon, the lines of her face set in determination. She had not spoken much since the auction, and Ethan had not pressed her. He had learned long ago that trust could not be rushed. But he knew something about this woman. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't broken by the hardships of life. She was a survivor. When they arrived at the ranch, it looked smaller than Ethan had remembered. The house was a simple structure, made of wood and stone, with a porch that creaked in the wind. The barn was a little worse for wear, but still standing. The land around them was dry and cracked, with only a few hardy plants pushing through the earth. The ranch had once been prosperous, but the weather and the isolation had slowly eaten away at it. Ethan had always thought that with a little hard work he could bring it back to life. But now, with Tala by his side, he felt a spark of hope. They unloaded the wagon, and as evening fell, Ethan showed Tala where she would sleep, a small room in the barn, far from the house. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was all they had. Tala didn't protest, though her eyes held a mixture of wariness and defiance. She wasn't used to this, being given a place to sleep, being offered work without strings attached. She wasn't used to people seeing her as anything other than what they wanted her to be. Ethan, for his part, didn't make her stay. He didn't make her do anything, but she could tell from the look in his eyes that he expected her to pull her weight. That night, under the wide-open sky, they ate dinner together in silence, a simple meal of beans and dried meat. The stars above seemed to stretch on forever, and the air was cool, a slight breeze moving through the plains. Ethan looked over at Tala, who was staring into the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she didn't seem to notice his gaze. "Tala?" he said after a long moment, his voice low. "I'm not asking for much. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. Just help me with the land." She didn't respond at first. Instead, she poked at the fire with a stick. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly, her voice sharp, but without the fire she had shown at the auction. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. "You can go," he said, "but I don't think you will. The desert isn't kind to those who don't know it." Tala's eyes flashed briefly to him, but she said nothing. There was something in her expression, something that told Ethan she wasn't entirely sure what she wanted anymore. "I've been here long enough to know what's worth fighting for," he added, his voice softening. "This land. It can be something. I've seen it before. It just needs work, and it needs people." Tala looked at him then, her eyes searching his face, trying to see beyond the surface. She couldn't figure him out. He was too calm, too steady. Everything about him seemed to tell her he was used to hardship. But what did he really want from her? The silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. The fire crackled, and the stars twinkled above them, a reminder of how vast the universe was. Ethan wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he felt like he might not be alone in this struggle. The next morning came too quickly, the sun rising over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Ethan was already at work, tending to the horses, checking the water supply, and making sure the land hadn't been completely swallowed by the drought. Tala watched him for a moment, her eyes following his movements. He worked with a quiet efficiency, moving from task to task without complaint. She couldn't help but respect that. But there was a part of her that still wanted to refuse, still wanted to walk away and let him figure it out on his own. It wasn't her problem. But something stopped her. Something about the way the land seemed to call to her, about the way Ethan didn't push her to do anything, yet still expected her to do her part. Finally, she stood and walked toward him, her boots crunching in the dry dirt. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Ethan turned to look at her, surprised, but there was no judgment in his eyes. "There's water to collect from the well," he said, "and the barn needs fixing up. We've got a lot to do, but if we work together, we'll make it." Tala nodded, and without another word, she walked toward the barn. She didn't have to like him, but she would work. She would work for the land, for herself, and for something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't about the ranch. It was something deeper, something primal that called to her, something that told her she needed this land as much as Ethan did. Over the next few days, they worked in near silence. The heat of the desert made everything harder, but they kept moving, kept pushing forward. Tala fixed the roof of the barn, while Ethan took care of the animals in the water. They didn't talk much, but there was a sense of understanding between them. It was clear they both knew that this was about more than just survival. It was about something bigger, something they couldn't put into words yet. One evening after another long day, they sat down to dinner again. The silence between them was comfortable now. Tala looked at Ethan, her eyes softening for the first time since she had arrived. "You could have just let me go," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "But you didn't." Ethan looked at her, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Sometimes it's not about letting go," he said. "It's about giving someone a reason to stay." The days grew longer, and the sun became more relentless as summer settled over the frontier. Ethan and Tala had settled into a routine, working side by side on the ranch. The work was hard, but they both found a rhythm, a way to get things done without much conversation. The silence between them had become comfortable, even if the weight of unspoken words still lingered. Tala had become more than just a worker on the ranch. She had proven herself to be strong, capable, and resourceful. She worked with a steady focus, and even Ethan had begun to admire her. Though she never said much, there was something about her, something in the way she moved, the way she handled the land, that spoke of a deeper understanding. She had a connection to the earth, just like him. But as the days went on, something started to feel wrong. The air was heavier than it should have been, the silence of the desert growing unnervingly still. Ethan couldn't quite place it, but his instincts told him something was coming, something dangerous. One evening, as they sat around the fire, a faint sound reached their ears. It was a soft hum, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. Tala's head snapped up, her eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan followed her gaze, but all he saw were the distant mountains and the darkening sky. "What's that?" Tala asked, her voice tense. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stood up, scanning the land. The hum seemed to be coming from somewhere in the distance, but there was no sign of movement. No sign of life. It was too quiet. "I don't know," he said slowly, "but we need to keep an eye on it." They spent the rest of the night in silence, the eerie hum echoing through the desert air. It wasn't the sound of a passing storm or the wind. It was something else, something unnatural. The next morning, Ethan woke early, his mind still troubled by the strange noise. Tala was already up, sitting outside, her sharp eyes watching the horizon. She had heard the hum, too, and she didn't trust it. "You think it's the raiders?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. Ethan shook his head. "No, this is different. Raiders don't make sounds like that." They had dealt with their fair share of troublemakers in the past. Out here, in the frontier, it was common for people to settle their differences with guns, but this felt different. The sound wasn't human. "We'll head out to the hills," Ethan said, motioning to the rocky outcrop to the west. "Get a better view. See if we can figure out what's going on." Tala nodded without hesitation. They packed up their gear, and with a steady pace, they made their way toward the hills. As they climbed higher, the hum seemed to grow louder, and the air around them felt thick and tense. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. When they reached the top of the hill, they could see for miles. The land stretched out before them, an endless sea of sand and rock. But there, in the distance, just beyond the horizon, was something they hadn't expected. A ship. It hovered just above the ground, its sleek metallic surface gleaming in the sunlight. The ship was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was far too advanced for anything they had on this world, and it wasn't alone. Several smaller ships, dark and menacing, circled around it like vultures. Tala's breath caught in her throat as she saw the ships. She had heard stories, ancient tales passed down through her people. Stories of otherworldly beings who had come to the desert long before humans had ever set foot here, tales of lost civilizations and powerful relics. She didn't know if those stories were true, but, looking at the ships now, she wasn't so sure they were just stories. "We need to go back," she said quietly, her voice urgent. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the ships. He could feel the tension rising in his chest. Something wasn't right. Whoever, or whatever, was in those ships wasn't here for peaceful reasons. They were here for something else. "We'll go," he said finally. "But we need to prepare. Whatever this is, it's not something we can ignore." They made their way back to the ranch, the weight of what they had seen hanging heavily in the air. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan knew that the life they had built here, in the quiet isolation of the desert, was about to change forever. The next few days were filled with a sense of urgency. Ethan worked quickly to reinforce the barn, making sure the doors were secure and the windows were covered. Tala spent her time gathering supplies, food, water, and whatever else they might need if things turned violent. Ethan didn't know what was coming, but he knew they had to be ready. They couldn't fight the unknown with nothing. And this wasn't something they could face alone. Late one evening, as they sat in the dim light of the fire, a noise broke the silence. This time, it wasn't the hum of the ships. It was something closer. Something human. A figure appeared in the distance, walking slowly toward the ranch. Ethan stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle at his side. Tala was already on her feet, her eyes sharp, watching the figure as it approached. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice steady but wary. The figure stopped, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, with a long coat flapping in the wind. He was tall, with a weathered face, and there was something about him, something familiar yet unsettling. "I'm looking for the rancher," the man called back. His voice was low, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "I've got something to show you." Ethan didn't lower his rifle. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then took a step forward. "My name's Donovan. I've been tracking those ships. I know what they are." Tala's gaze shifted to Ethan, who remained silent for a moment, considering the man's words. "You're not from around here," Ethan said finally, his voice guarded. Donovan nodded. "No, but I've been tracking these ships for months. They're not just here to visit. They're here for something. And if you want to survive, you need to know what that is." Ethan and Tala exchanged a look. There was a lot they didn't know, but one thing was clear. The ships were a threat, and they had to be prepared. "Come inside," Ethan said. "We'll talk." The next few days were filled with an air of tension. Ethan, Tala, and Donovan had made their plans, but there was still much to prepare for. The desert was vast, and the silence was sometimes even louder than the strange hum they had heard before. But now they knew they weren't just waiting for raiders or natural storms. They were waiting for something far more dangerous. Something that had come from beyond the stars. Ethan spent the early morning hours reinforcing the ranch. The barn had been fortified as best as they could, and every door and window had been sealed. The land, though dry and barren, was still their home, and they would defend it no matter what. Tala, her face set with determination, had worked alongside him. Despite the silence between them, they both knew the importance of what they were doing. The tools they used felt heavier now, knowing they were facing something unknown, something otherworldly. Donovan, meanwhile, had been setting up equipment. He had brought strange devices with him, things that seemed out of place on the frontier. Small, compact pieces of technology that hummed quietly, almost like they were alive. Tala had never seen anything like it. Donovan's explanation had been brief, but it was enough to make her understand. The devices were trackers, sensors, and alarms, things designed to detect movements, monitor the land, and, most importantly, pick up any signals from the ships. "They'll be here soon," Donovan had warned them the night before. "When they come, you'll know. These ships don't land. They hover. We won't get much time." Ethan had set his jaw. "We don't need time. We need to be ready." By midday, the ranch was ready. The land had been scoured for anything that could be used as a weapon. The makeshift barricades were set up, and the small barn had become their base of operations. The air felt thick with expectation, as though the very earth beneath their feet was waiting for something to happen. It was then that the hum returned. The sound came faintly at first, just on the edge of hearing. But it grew, rising in volume until it filled the air around them, vibrating through the ground. Tala's eyes shot to the horizon, and Ethan quickly followed her gaze. The ships were coming. "They're close," Donovan said, his voice tight with urgency. "Prepare yourselves." Ethan and Tala moved swiftly. They had their plan, and there was no room for hesitation. The devices Donovan had set up began to beep, signaling the ship's approach. Ethan checked his rifle and motioned for Tala to follow him to the barn's reinforced door. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. Tala nodded. There was no need for more words. They had come to understand each other in ways that words could not express. The past few weeks had forged a bond between them, not one of friendship necessarily, but of shared survival, of shared determination. The hum grew louder. Then, suddenly, it stopped. There was a silence that stretched far beyond the normal stillness of the desert, and Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't have to say anything. They all knew what came next. From behind the hills, the first of the ships appeared. It was massive, its sleek, metallic surface reflecting the setting sun in a blinding flash. It hovered just above the ground, a ghost in the sky. The smaller ships followed in formation, circling the larger craft like vultures. Ethan and Tala stood at the ready, their eyes locked on the ships as they approached. The air seemed to thicken around them, and the earth beneath their feet felt like it was shifting. "They'll land near the canyon," Donovan said, his voice grave. "That's where they'll search. But we can't let them get close. Not if they're looking for something buried." Ethan nodded. "Then we stop them before they can search." The battle began quickly. The first ship landed in a cloud of dust, its heavy frame settling onto the barren ground. From the hatch, figures began to emerge. Tall, cloaked in black, with strange alien features that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Their eyes were covered by dark, reflective visors, and they moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if they were more machine than flesh. Ethan raised his rifle, his fingers steady on the trigger. He didn't hesitate. The first shot rang out, and the figure closest to the ship staggered backward, a sharp cry escaping from its throat. The others scattered, moving quickly, their movements sharp and fast.
They were well-trained. Too well-trained.
But they weren't prepared for Ethan's precision. Tala moved beside him, her bow in hand, an ancient weapon that felt like an extension of herself. She aimed quickly, firing an arrow with deadly accuracy, taking down another of the aliens. There was no time for mercy, no time to question who they were or why they were here. They were a threat, and that was all that mattered. More ships appeared on the horizon, and Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that the battle was only just beginning. The aliens were here in force. As the fight raged on, Tala and Ethan worked as one, each covering the other's back, each protecting the land they'd come to call home. Donovan stayed back, using his technology to track the aliens' movements and providing support with the small weapons he had. His eyes flicked over to the canyon, the place where the aliens had planned to search. That's where the real danger lay. "Ethan!" Donovan called. "They're heading for the canyon!" "They'll find it." Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Tala's arm and nodded toward the canyon. "We're going to stop them," he said, his voice hard. Tala didn't question him. She followed his lead, and they both moved toward the canyon, pushing their way through the thick dust that now swirled around them. The canyon was just ahead, and as they approached, Ethan could see the alien figures closing in on the entrance. There was no time to waste. Ethan and Tala dove into position, their movements swift and coordinated. They fired their last shots, taking down the last of the alien soldiers before they could enter the canyon. "Not today," Ethan muttered under his breath. They rushed to the entrance of the canyon, knowing that whatever the aliens were looking for, it was hidden deep within. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet as they moved, and the air felt heavier. Ethan could almost hear the pulse of the earth itself, as though it was alive, protecting its secrets. At the far end of the canyon, a small stone structure stood, half buried in the sand. It was ancient, its design unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. The door was sealed, but a small symbol was carved into the stone. A symbol that made Tala stop in her tracks. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is what they've been looking for." Ethan turned to her, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Tala swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. "I don't know. But it's powerful, and they won't stop until they have it." They moved toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. They had fought for the land, for each other, and now they were fighting for something much bigger. Something that could change everything. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond.